Hi, everybody out there. Once again, we have Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Financial Systems to talk about what's going on with Ukraine and the United States and NATO countries in Europe and what it is coming to now. What they're doing now is trying to knock out Putin's ambitions, quote, ambitions, by hitting them economically. And I guess what they did just today, Mark, is to cut out some selected banks in Russia with the SWIFT system. Now, would you explain what that's all about, what SWIFT is all about?
Sure. SWIFT is the banking system that international banks use to do business. So essentially, by cutting that down, those selected Russian banks will not be able to do any kind of transactions whatsoever. So essentially, in theory, they would be able to go bankrupt, but of course, the U.S. has put exemptions out there that only certain Russian banks are going to be targeted, and then certain transactions are going to be targeted. And I can probably assume that the transactions that will not be targeted will be oil, because all oil transactions are done through the SWIFT system. So if you block the bank from doing a SWIFT transaction in oil, Western Europe would not be able to buy any oil from Europe, which they rely on very, very much.
And we're also buying more Russian oil, are we not?
Well, we're not. The United States is not buying a lot of Russian oil. We've always kind of gone to the Middle East to get ours. But the point of the matter, if Russian oil prices go up, well, the oil prices in Saudi Arabia are going to go up. But last time I checked here a few minutes ago, oil prices were up about 7% in overnight markets.
So how effective will kicking Russia out of SWIFT be?
I don't think it's going to be that effective. For one reason, one of the Russian ambassadors or PR people had already said they'd already been kind of gaming the system here for the last 3 months to figure out ways to bypass any sanctions. So they obviously have a backup plan to go with. Two, we know Western Europe is going to need the oil, so there's still going to be transactions that are going to go through. Three, the sanctions are only on selected banks that aren't even going to take effect immediately. They're not. So the sanctions, from my understanding, won't take effect for like another 20 to 25 days. And even then, it's selected banks. So what's stopping if Bank A gets sanctioned? What's stopping Bank A from basically doing business with Bank B and letting Bank B do its international transactions with Europe?
So there's plenty of back doors there, plenty of loopholes.
There's plenty of back doors. Now, where the concern will come in at is, that, of course, over the weekend, there's been massive runs on the ATM machines of those Russian banks. So a lot of those ATM machines are now out of money. I'm going to be very curious to see what's going to happen to those exact same Russian banks tonight, tomorrow morning in Russia, when those banks open their doors, and the runs on those. If those runs are large enough, as we've seen here in the United States during 2008, those banks could go bankrupt.
And then what happens to the Russian economy?
Well, you basically see the same thing that happened with the United States in 2008. You see a lot of the major banks go under, and then Russia is going to be stuck in a situation to where they're going to have to inject money into the system. And where does that money come from if you can't tap into the SWIFT system? So think of it this way. Imagine 2008 and the government could not do anything to inject money or do any of the bailout plans they put in place. In this scenario, Russia would be faced with the same banking problem, but wouldn't have any funds to do like a TARP or anything like the United States did in 2008.
So is that severe and permanent damage to the Russian economy?
That would be a pretty bad blow to the Russian economy. It would take them a while to recover from it.
What are some of the other hits that they're taking that we're imposing on them?
Right now, it's pretty much just the SWIFT transactions. Kind of some little minor things. UPS and FedEx announced this afternoon that they would be stopping all transactions with Russia for the short term. All the countries in Europe, all the NATO countries at least, have basically blocked any Russian planes from landing or any Russian planes leaving from Western Europe to go to Russia.
Now, you say that the ruble is already taking a hit?
The ruble's already dropped about 30% already, after already taking just a beating this past week already. And what's kind of interesting about it, the last time you saw the ruble drop this much actually goes back to Long-Term Capital, which was a hedge fund that made a huge bet on Russia in 1998. And the Russian ruble and Russian bonds basically collapsed and that hedge fund actually went bankrupt, it actually prompted the Federal Reserve to go in and make an emergency rate cut because you had basically billions and billions of dollars that disappeared instantly.
But Mark, I would assume that Putin gamed all this out ahead of time, all the economic sanctions that we could be imposing on him, and his calculation must have been that he could weather them.
I think his calculation has been way off. I mean, I've already seen reports that he's very upset that the Russian military has not achieved any of the objectives that it set out in the first 3 days. I think the Javelin missiles and the Stinger missiles are really setting back his plans.
Before we get into that, back on the economic track here. So the ruble is already down, what, 30%?
On the day.
And how is this going to affect the stock market tomorrow morning?
Well, see, right now, if you look at the overnight markets on the U.S. futures market, the S&P 500 is down about 2.5%, and the NASDAQ futures are down about 3%. So basically, the entire rally we made on Friday, that entire Friday rally is going to be reversed and taken away.
And you think this will continue, the downward trend?
As long as we keep having news come out that Putin's going to think about using chemical weapons, he's already put his, I think the bulk of the sell-off goes to, on Saturday, he put his nuclear response team on combat readiness.
Right.
What does that mean? That's one of the questions. Is he gearing up to use tactical missiles in the Ukraine?
So that means that the market will continue to be affected as long as we keep getting that kind of dire news.
Correct. The markets sell off on unknowns. If they can't get a really good grip about what's going on, the easiest solution is just sell your securities until you get a better grip on it. So right now we're faced with, will Putin use chemical weapons? Will he use tactical nukes? And if that happens, will NATO take a bigger step in there? And if NATO takes a bigger step in there, well, now are you literally looking at World War III?
Yeah, but in terms of the economy, now just the rise in oil prices, which Biden already says are coming, and we have to accept it in order to stick with our values. How much is that going to affect generally the American economy and the consumer?
Gasoline prices and oil prices have already made huge jumps last week on the initial invasion, and now tonight they're even making a bigger move. Like I said, oil prices are up about 7% as we speak. That's going to have a big effect on gas prices here in the United States in the next few weeks. And with that being said, there's already been calls for Biden to open up the U.S. drilling market and have the U.S. drill more and more oil. And he's already said he's not, just today.
Yeah, so therefore, gas prices will continue rising, and
Correct.
therefore the stock market and the whole U.S. economy will be severely affected, moderately affected, or not much at all.
At this point, I'm going to say moderately affected. And just kind of add to that, with all the things that have happened here in just the news events that have come out here in the last 24 hours, you look at, Friday or Thursday of last week, almost every brokerage firm on Wall Street was predicting around a 75 to 80% chance the Fed would raise interest rates 50 basis points at the next meeting. That number, as of this evening, now has dropped down. There's only a 2% probability the Fed will raise interest rates 50 basis points at its next meeting.
25 basis points, perhaps, instead?
25 might be on the table, but the 50 basis points now really doesn't look like it's going to happen.
For the layman out there, 50 basis points equals 0.5%, a quarter, 25 quarter%. But even a quarter% does affect the economy. Interest rates, it goes back to credit and loans and all that, correct?
Correct, because if you raise interest rates on 25 bips on, let's say, $1 billion, well, that's a little bit of interest. But you start talking about raising 25 bips on 10, 20 trillion, now you're talking a very large interest payment that has to be laid out.
Yeah, now it's, with this, does this mean, what's trending now with Ukraine and Russia and the US and NATO, does that mean that the Federal Reserve may drop entirely its plans to raise interest rates, at least for a while?
I think they'll at least delay it to at least let this thing calm down a little bit. They're still going to have to raise interest rates because oil prices are going to keep going higher. I don't see any really relief on the supply chain issues. So it looks like, they're going to raise rates. It just might not be as quickly as everyone's anticipating.
one thing is compounding the other, and this is like a multiple faceted crisis that's developing and just mushrooming, to use an unfortunate image at this point, considering talk about nuclear war. I mean, really, it's a whole bunch of things impinging now, working together against the U.S. economy. Correct?
That is correct. Another thing I'll also add there, for tomorrow's market, U.S. market opens, another big unknown is, we talked about earlier that, banks like Sberbank, which is Russia's largest bank, might face going into bankruptcy. How much exposure does J.P. Morgan and Bank of America actually have to Sberbank bonds?
Now, how do you think that all this is going to end?
Based on history, I think you'll rattle the sabers a little bit. The conflicts will get a little bit more drawn out. But as long as there's no large counter military operation, and by that I mean NATO goes in there and starts putting troops in. Once you start putting NATO troops in there, you've pretty much dragged the United States into the conflict. And I don't see them at this point getting into it, but we're slowly moving in that direction.
And that's where it could escalate really out of control.
That's where it could really get out of control, because let's say you put U.S. advisors on the ground there, and a U.S. advisor gets killed in a conflict from Russia, there's just going to be a lot of protests here in the United States that the United States has to take a bigger role in doing something with Russia. And that's where it's just going to go start compounding in a very bad way.
Yeah, there's some analysts that are not seen on American TV that say that Putin isn't really the bad guy here entirely. For years, they say he's been attempting to negotiate to keep NATO from expanding any further eastward, because that was the original deal after the Soviet Union fell apart. And he also wants the Ukrainians to stop attacking the Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. And it's been to no avail. Putin has made that case. He's laid it out clearly. He's asked for negotiations. He asked for compromise, and he's been shunned. So therefore, he's been forced into this position. Now, is there merit in that?
I would totally agree with that. You watch the news, everyone says that Putin's the bad guy, the evil guy.
Right.
No, he said, when the Soviet Union officially, the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed, the deal cut was NATO would not make any more expansion towards the east. And since the Berlin Wall's come down, there's been an extremely aggressive expansion of NATO moving. I mean, look at all the Iron Curtain countries. Almost every communist country in Eastern Europe is now a member of NATO, with NATO military units sitting.
Yeah, and again, a comparison we've made before is in the 60s, when Khrushchev, the premier of Russia at the time, brought nuclear missiles into Cuba, 90 miles off our shore. Right. We almost went to war with the Soviet Union. That was our red line. Now the situation is reversed, but we don't see it that way.
We don't see it and the thing about it is, just like in the 1960s, the United States kept telling, Soviet Union, hey, you can't do this. You're putting us in a bad situation. Just right. Like Putin here over the past, several years, I said, hey, this is not the deal we originally cut. You're putting me in a really, really bad spot. And nobody listened.
Yeah. Well, also now they're putting out, I think it may just be American propaganda that Putin is deranged. He's a madman. Do you believe that?
I don't think he's gone mad or insane. I think he's just in a really bad spot and just really doesn't have a lot of options to go with, because the only people that can help him solve his problems are the exact same people that's causing him problems.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a good situation the way this is developed, and again, history has shown, and this is something we were worried about all during the Cold War years, that through miscalculation, incompetence, mistakes, the worst could happen.
Yeah, it just takes, someone that puts their finger on the fire button and shoots down a U.S. jet, or, look at how World War I started. It started with a passenger ship being torpedoed by a German submarine. And that's what got the United States involved in it, is because the Germans basically sunk an unarmed passenger ship, and that started World War I for the United States.
Yeah, and recalling Dr. Strangelove, that scenario,
Yeah,
if somebody on one of the many sides involved here may go a little nuts or get a little rambunctious and push a button that's going to bring everything else into the conflict. I mean,
yeah,
even that's a possibility.
yeah. You're putting pressure on a guy that's really in a desperate situation.
Well, we'll see. I guess we'll see how this is going to turn out. Maybe, what do you think? We'll know in the next few days, the next week or so, it'll all come to the head one way or the other. What do you think?
I think we'll get a much better idea here in the next 2 or 3 days. Even though Russia has been very slowed down for a multitude of reasons, they're still moving towards the capital. I think the original plan was probably take the capital by Thursday. They're nowhere near taking it right now. Another thing that's really surprised me on this, and this also puts Putin in a bad spot, is it really looks like Russia might just be a paper tiger. Like the U.S. military, I used to be in the Army. We used to thrive on night operations. We had the best night vision in the world. We really did our main stuff at nighttime because we could see our enemies so clearly with all the technology. I'm very surprised Russia's not doing that. And the reason why is because the night in Russia during the nighttime, or the Ukraine at nighttime, military night operations are almost non-existent. There's nothing going on. So that kind of tells me, do they not have the night vision technology that an army of that size should have?
Well, another bit here is that, again, Putin's a bad guy and this and that, and he's being stymied, the advance is being slowed and all that. Well, according to some non-mainstream analysts, that's because he's not firing on civilians. He's ordered his soldiers not to fire on civilians. Now, that isn't necessarily out of humanitarian concerns, but that he doesn't want to enrage the Ukrainian population against him in Russia after he topples the Zelensky government, which is his plan. So, if that's true, that if Russian soldiers are not firing on civilians who are firing at them, that is why the advance has been slowed, not necessarily through the Russians being a paper tiger.
It could be that, and I think the main reason he doesn't want that is because NATO does have a humanitarian objective within its guidelines. If you start firing aggressively on citizens, on unarmed citizens, that could trigger the humanitarian clause of NATO. But besides that, when you start a military operation, especially with Putin only having about 180,000 soldiers on the ground, 180,000 soldiers going up against a 44 million person population. If just 1% of that population decides to resist you, that's going to give that 180,000 a run for the money. The only way that you can conduct that is you have to be very, very aggressive on knocking out your enemy's air support. And right now, the Ukraine Air Force has only had I'll call it a dent at this thing. They're still almost fully operational. I don't understand why he wouldn't, or maybe he just can't do it because of the Stinger missiles or whatever. But the Ukraine's Air Force is almost running at, I'd say, at 95% operational efficiency.
Yeah. See, that's something else that I can't figure out, that Putin didn't anticipate the Stinger missiles and the other ones that knock out the javelins.
Yeah.
Didn't he realize that there were enough of them in Ukraine provided by us that would give him a hard time?
That's just another mystery just to add to it. I think Putin's a fairly, calculated person, and this has really been just a bad miscalculation. This could have come down to one of those things. He put such a small number of forces on the border. He may have used that as more of a negotiation tool. And when he saw negotiations were going no place, because here in about another 2 weeks, it's going to be so muddy in the Ukraine from the winter thaw, those tanks just really aren't going to be able to move very effectively. He may have been like, I've got to do something to put even more pressure on negotiations. And that could be why he kind of flipped the gun a little too fast.
And, Zelensky has ordered all Ukrainians between the ages of 18 and 60 to stay in the country and pick up a gun and fight. So, in a way, he's exposing his own civilians, even young civilians, to enemy fire, although Putin is reluctant to fire on them. So, it's an interesting dynamic that's going on there in terms of who's concerned about civilian casualties.
Well, yeah, I mean, country patriotism goes a long ways. The Ukraine people, they don't, I think for Putin may have made a mistake. He thought Ukraine was going to welcome him with open arms, and they're not. He's having a very large part of the population is taking up guns against him. Just earlier tonight, I saw Miss Ukraine was walking down the street with an AK-47.
Right. Well, I don't know if he thought that the Ukrainians would welcome him with open arms. What I think he was trying to do is defang Ukrainians from attacking eastern Ukraine, which is, largely identified with Russia. Not so much that he thought the population would welcome him, just trying not to antagonize the population further by taking on civilian casualties. He wanted to just oust Zelensky, and he said he didn't want to occupy the country. He just wanted his government in rather than what he considers a puppet government of the U.S. Originally, it was a Russian leaning government in there that we overthrew and put in one of our guys. So, this has been going back and forth. But again, not to take sides, not to assign blame to one side or other. But what I'm trying to get across is it's a much more complex picture than you get from the American media.
Correct. Yeah, the American media is trying to get they don't want to give any sympathy to Putin, but at the end of the day, he's been asking for help on this situation with NATO expansion, and nobody really seemed to care. They just kept on going and going and going, and then he really didn't have any choice, in my opinion.
Well, we'll see soon, I guess, how this is going to turn out. So, Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Financial, thanks very much again for being with us and providing your financial insight.